Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. Before we get into this week's special episode, I'd like to tell you about our sponsors. Scrivener is an author's best friend. From the brainstorming phase to outlining to writing to editing and then to publishing, Scrivener offers a unique set of tools designed especially for writers. Go to getscrivener.com today and use the code HANK at checkout to receive 20% off. Your writing will thank you for it. Also, I'd like to thank Third Scribe for sponsoring the podcast. Third Scribe is the place for writers to connect with readers in a unique social setting. Go to thirdscribe.com/sign-up and visit the Author Stories forums at Third Scribe also. Just click on the link in the show notes. Now on to our show.
If the editor does the job properly, the contribution of the editor is essentially invisible. The reader is not in the position of having seen the work as it existed, prior to the editor's involvement, and how much it changes after that can vary tremendously. Sometimes there's very little difference. Some writers are just naturally, perfect. Other writers, write very quickly, maybe, or just need to have somebody else's eye applied to the work and point things out, and things can change quite a bit more. So, and there have been arguments over the years since it was instituted, for example, about whether the Hugo Award for editors can really be judged properly by the voters, because they're just not in a position to really see the whole process. They have to guess to a certain extent. You can draw conclusions maybe about at least an editor's taste by who they happen to choose to work with, who they discover or otherwise manage to add to their lists. And but you really don't know the real heart of the editorial process is really always going to be invisible to everybody except the author and the editor.
Right. Well, tell us a little bit about how you got to be in this position. What was it that made you want to pursue this path?
Okay. Well, I'm a lifelong SF and fantasy reader, going back to the very earliest days of my being able to read at all. And according to family lore, I actually had an interest in the whole area, the whole subject of science and the future and the imagination, even before I could read, or just was very, very beginning. When Sputnik was launched in, I guess it was 1957, so I was like 6 years old, and I was already telling my grandfather, I don't remember this, but this is what I've been told. I was already telling my grandfather at that age that this was a momentous occasion. I'd have said momentous at 6, but anyway, it was an important occasion, a major, revolutionary moment in humanity's history, and that our future was never going to be the same now that space travel was going to become possible. So right from a very early age, I was interested in this stuff, and in fact, so much so that unlike a lot of people who can tell you, what the first SF or fantasy thing was that they read that turned them into, dedicated readers or fans, I can't. I don't know what the first thing I read was. It just seems to me that it's always been there, part of my life, and nothing else has ever been as important to me as SF and fantasy. So right from the beginning, I was thinking in terms of wanting to do something related to it, but originally that meant to me becoming a scientist, and that was really what I wanted to do for the first 15, 16, 17 years of my life, and I was thinking mostly in terms of physics, which is what interested me the most at that time, and but somewhere in there it began to become obvious that although I was okay at science, I got a decent grade at science and decent grades at math, that my natural talents lay elsewhere. I was almost always was getting better grades in English than in math and science, and kind of the real turning point in that regard was towards the end of high school when you take the SATs in preparation to applying for colleges. and I got a perfect score on the verbal SAT, and only about a very good score, like 600 out of 800 or something like that on the math. The school I went to was kind of surprised that they thought I was that smart. And there was another kid who'd gotten an 800 on the math part of the test. So they actually announced the results over the PA system and congratulated each of us for our accomplishment. And I kind of thought, well, gee, maybe I really should be thinking in terms of, writing or editing or something rather than science. Because it was evident at that point that, okay, I was smart enough to probably push my way through and become at least a mediocre scientist, but maybe I'd be more than a mediocre writer or editor. And so when I went to college, I didn't become a science major. I became an English major, and in fact a writing major. And because that was originally what I wanted to do, was write. And there too, after a while, I sort of watching myself progress and comparing myself to other people in the writing program, I sort of feel like, yeah, okay, you can do this, but it's not really your strength. I didn't have the deep fund of stories I wanted to tell, or the powerful urge to want to tell stories that you have to be a successful writer and work against the various odds that aspiring writers face. So that began to sort of work on my mind. And it was kind of like a classic thing. Those who can't do something, think about teaching it. I had one story published while I was in college. I sold a story to Damon Knight for his Orbit series of original anthologies published in hardcover. And I sold it to him just at the point when he was switching publishers, and so I appeared my story appeared in Orbit 16, which was the first volume when he switched to, as it was then, Harper and Row, now HarperCollins. So that was pretty cool. I mean, all my friends were very impressed that I was published. I wasn't even, 21 yet. Simultaneously, through a series of strange accidents, I had my first publishing job while I was still in college. And at the time, it seemed to me that this was such a remarkable, circumstance that it truly meant that I was destined for publishing greatness. Here I was. I got my first publishing job when I was literally 18, and I knew that people like Michael Moorcock had edited a magazine when he was still in his teens in England. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be following in this incredible tradition. So what happened there was that in the summer between high school and college, my family spent about half the summer. This was the summer of '69. So luckily for me, we were still home when the moon landing occurred, and I was able to watch it on TV here in New York. But later that summer, we went to Israel for about 4 or 5 weeks. I don't remember exactly, and visiting family there and just generally touring. I had only been there once before, and that was when I was a baby. My mother took me over for her parents to see me, her first child, and I never actually met my mother's parents, in a way that I can remember, because they passed away before I went back. So at least they got to see me, even if not vice versa. So anyway, so we were there, and naturally I took with me all kinds of reading matter, because I knew we weren't going to be touring every minute of the time, and I'd have quiet moments when I'd want to relax. But I did eventually go through it all, and I ran out of stuff to read in English, and my Hebrew is mediocre would be a compliment. So I just didn't have it's funny. I mean, I went to Jewish schools, Hebrew day schools or yeshiva for the whole first 12 years before college, and it just never really penetrated. My sisters were very good at it, and I don't know if I wasn't interested or I just had some kind of block about dealing with another language. But I just sort of plodded through there and just waited for it to be over. So anyway, the point is I needed some more English reading matter, and we happened to be we had a rented apartment in Jerusalem, but we were in Tel Aviv at one point, and we went to one of the branches of the biggest bookstore chain in Israel, Steinmatzky's, and they had magazines from America there, as well as books from America and the UK. And I bought some books, and I also bought an issue of a magazine. It was an issue of Amazing Stories, which of course is the first science fiction magazine, which was founded in 1926 by Hugo Gernsback, the man whom the Hugo Award is named for. And I had not been a regular reader of the magazines. I mean, I was aware of them, but I always kind of felt at that point that a book was a better value. It seemed somehow to me that a book had been through more of a vetting process. People didn't make it into book form unless they established themselves to a certain extent. And that with a magazine, it was more of a crapshoot, and you might get some good stories and some not so good stories. And I had limited money as a kid, so I didn't tend to read the magazines, which I'm sorry about now, because if I had read the magazines regularly, I would have been aware of fandom a lot sooner. So anyway, I bought an issue of Amazing, and I bought it because it had, besides whichever short stories were in that issue, the serialized novel was just that they would always have back then, was beginning in that issue, and it was the first half of a novel by Robert Silverberg, one of my favorite writers, called Up the Line, a time travel story, and I love time travel stories. So I thought, great, I'll read this. So that issue was one of the turning points of my life because, first of all, Ted White, who was editing Amazing then, had reinstated the Clubhouse column, which was a column about fandom and reviewing fanzines and talking about conventions and so on. So I became aware of fandom's existence by having picked up that issue. And secondly, when I finished reading the first half of Bob's novel, I wanted to read the rest of it, and we never did get back to Steinmatzky's a second time. But I figured, okay, well, when I get back to New York, I'll pick it up there. And what I hadn't really thought about was that because of the time lag in shipment, the issues on the newsstand back in the States were already, 2 or 3 months beyond where I thought, they should be based on that issue. So I don't remember. It was probably something like a May or a June issue that I bought in, July or August, and by the time we got back to New York, the issues on the stands would have been, the September or October issues. So I needed the immediately succeeding one. And I happened to notice when I looked in the magazine that the masthead indicated that the offices of the publisher, Ultimate Publications, was not only in New York, as you might expect for most magazines, but actually in Queens, where I live, not in Manhattan. And I thought, that's really interesting. They're in Queens. And I thought, well, there are a few scattered little office buildings around Queens, and it's a small company probably. So, maybe it's, on the second story of a 2 or 3 story, commercial structure, and there'll be a few offices with an editor and an art director and the production person, and, maybe there'll be like a barber shop downstairs or something like that. So I got on my bike and, looked up the map and figured out where I had to go, and I rode my bike to go to this office. Now, this is late in the summer of 1969, just the same year I was starting college. And so I rode my bike. It must have been about a half an hour ride on the bike. And, I finally tracked down the address, and I found myself on a very quiet street in one of the less dense parts of Queens. One side of the street was actually the edge of a park, Cunningham Park, and the other side of the street was these little one-story ranch houses. And I went up to the one with the address corresponding to the magazine, and I thought, gee, this is really strange. This is a house, not an office building. But I rang the bell, and I said, a man came to the door, and it was hot, summertime. A man came to the door just wearing, a sleeveless T-shirt. Old guy. And a little confused to shave, actually. And I said, excuse me, I'm looking for the offices of Ultimate Publications, publishers of Amazing Stories and Fantastic. And he said, yeah. And I said, you mean this is it? He said, yeah, I'm the publisher, Saul Cohen. I said, oh, okay. Well, my name is Moshe Feder. I bought a copy of Amazing in Israel, and he's now he's getting all excited. His name is Moshe? You brought Amazing in Israel? Oh, my God. Oh, please come in. So Saul Cohen, right? I mean, he's this old Jewish guy. He's all excited that a Jewish kid has shown up, and has reporting that he's been able to buy the magazine in Israel. So he invites me in, introduces me to his wife, and his very ancient Dachshund, and sits me down, offers me a glass of lemonade. And, at that point, what I call the nice Jewish boy effect takes over. They're just delighted to meet me. They're just, they're Shepping Nachas, even though they don't know me, as the phrase goes. They're just delighted that someone like me exists. And they, of course, they give me the issue I want for free. They offer me the next few issues for free. And they want to hear my whole life story. And they,
and this has to be the most surreal thing in the world to you.
Well, can you imagine how I'm this 18-year-old kid, right. And all of a sudden I'm meeting the publisher and his wife, who turns out to be the business manager, and I'm just boggled because it's his little house, and
right.
He has the complete run of amazing stories back to 1926 in bound volumes from the original publisher's office, and I'm just, I cannot believe what I'm seeing here. So. Anyway, I told him in the course of the conversation, I must have been there at least an hour. It would, Mr. Cohen, it would mean so much to me if there's ever anything I can do to help Amazing, the oldest magazine in the field. Please call upon me. There was no email back then, but I gave him my phone number. And let me know if there's ever anything I can do. I don't care about money. I'll do it like an internship. Anything
right.
at all. So I go off and, I'm just, rode home in a daze, really. Can hardly believe my luck. And I'm thinking, wow, this could lead to big things. Who knows what might happen. So a few months go by, school starts, and I'm all very busy with that and making the adjustments from having been in a private school all my life to being in a public university at Queens College, City University of New York. And somewhere in late fall, I get a call from Saul, and he says, Alan Shaw, who has been helping us out here in New York, a friend of the editor, Ted White's, has to leave. I don't think he ever told me why Alan had to leave. Now, Alan was only a few years older than me. He was in his early 20s. He said, would you be interested in taking over for him? You'd have to proofread the galleys for each issue of both Amazing and Fantastic, and also help us with the slush pile for both magazines. Even though submissions were supposed to go to Ted, and Ted was down at his home in Falls Church, Virginia, inevitably some stuff came to New York. People just didn't read the map Ted carefully enough, and they just assumed that it should go to the publisher's office. So quite a bit came to Oakland Gardens, which is where the house was. I said, yeah, sure, yeah. And I probably can't really pay you much of anything. Maybe I'll give you an occasional token kind of stipend, a check for $25 here and there, and you'll have your pick of some of the extra review copies that come in, but your name will be on the masthead. You'll be the assistant editor of Amazing and Fantastic. I'm thinking, holy, I don't want to, curse here, but it's just like I could not believe it. It's just astonishing. I had gone from being, nobody in particular to being the assistant editor of Amazing, right, just because I, was a nice Jewish boy who showed up for a back issue of the magazine. So that's where my career, began, and I ended up doing that all through college. And, in a sort of parallel way, I got to meet Ted through fandom as well, and did my best to proofread accurately and leave it up to the readers to decide if I succeeded. But I really put a lot of effort into the slush pile reading because I knew from my own efforts as a aspiring writer how much aspiring writers are dying for any kind of feedback from somebody objective and presumably knowledgeable. And even though we had the printed rejection slips, I would always write people a little note, and sometimes not so little if I felt I had something useful to suggest. And I got letters back sometimes, or notes attached to later manuscripts from authors thanking me. And the best case of that, although I didn't know it at the time, was that there was one writer who I thought was really quite promising, and I just felt his story was just short of recommending to Ted. But I said, I told him, this is great. I think here's how you can improve it, but you're going to make it. Just keep up, don't give up. Stuff like that. And some years later, I got a book in the mail. One of those typical, jiffy bags, as they used to be, with the the sort of crushed up or minced up papers that they used to use in between the layers of the wrapping instead of the bubble stuff we have now.
Right.
And it was a paperback from Del Rey, and it was dedicated to me. And I was completely stunned. Why is this person dedicating this book to me? And it was the first novel published by Lawrence Watt Evans. And he had dedicated the book to me because he said in the dedication I was the first editor to take him seriously and encourage him. And I contacted him, of course, and I said, Lawrence, what about your parents? What about your wife? Or if you have one. Right. And I said, no, you don't know how important you were to me, that you gave me that feedback way back in the early 70s, and I just never forgot that, and it just made all the difference and stuff like that. So, of course, I didn't know that at the time, but I was clearly doing the right thing. So I did that, and I sold that story, and I got out of college, and I thought, okay, well, I'm in good shape now. I'm going to be, all my friends on the Collins newspaper, where I ended up being by the time I was a junior and a senior, I was a copy editor, and I was the editor of a literary magazine supplement, and all my friends on the Collins newspaper, they all were going to go off and do other things completely, or some of them who really were into it wanted to become journalists and ended up going to Columbia Journalism School. But I wanted to work in book publishing. By this time, I figured out, there weren't a lot of magazine editor jobs around, but maybe I'd have a shot at getting to be a book editor eventually. So I went around, made the rounds everywhere, and proudly talked about my credentials, which I knew were much better than a typical college student would have to be. And it didn't really work. A lot of people in book publishing were only vaguely aware, or maybe completely unaware, that SF magazines still existed. They weren't terribly impressed, I guess, by magazines with names like Amazing and Fantastic. Those sounded kind of corny, or I don't know, kitschy or something. And and I also, perhaps, or in all likelihood, didn't compare well to some of the other candidates in certain other respects. So what would happen typically was I would get, the first interview would go well, and then I'd be called back for a second interview and be told, well, we're down to 2 or 3 people, and the editor you'd be working for wants to meet you, etc. And every time, and it must have happened at least half a dozen times, maybe more, I would end up not getting the job, and I would find out later that some young woman who could type faster than I could had gotten the job. I actually started to feel like a victim of reverse sex discrimination. And typing was very important back then because there were we didn't have computers yet. There's no word processing, so when you made a mistake, you had to stop and correct it laboriously. And later on, I became a much better typist, but I think even less. I think that was less important than the fact that you can, correct yourself so easily on a computer typing system. So perhaps if I had come along 10 years later, the fact that they could type, 60 words a minute and I could type 50 or 45, would not have made a big difference to people. But I just got very discouraged after a while. I was trying, and I was, as it was, I wasn't thrilled about applying for jobs that weren't specifically science fiction. They were just any kind of publishing job. And I knew that I would have to find my way to an SF job as quickly as possible, or the whole thing would just become, a real drag. My father said, I could come work for him. He had a small business. It was just literally, 2 or 3 people. We're not talking like a big corporation here. He was a little, bourgeois entrepreneur. He had a business selling and recycling corrugated boxes. So that's like, however dull it might have been for me to work in some non-science fiction area publishing, corrugated boxes seemed like a much worse prospect.
Right.
So that kept me going for a while. And meanwhile, because I had all through this period been progressing in fandom, I started a science fiction club at Queens College. I arranged for all of us to start going to conventions. And by 1971, I attended my first Worldcon in Boston, and skipped 72 because it was in Los Angeles and I couldn't afford to go to California, but 73 was in Toronto and I went to that. So by the time I graduated in 73, I was already pretty plugged into the science fiction community, and that turned out to be a lifesaver to a certain extent because it allowed me to hear about work opportunities that I never would have heard about otherwise. And I'm sure you've seen, if you know books like Color Is Your Parachute and so on, knowing people is usually the best way to get a job.
Right.
And I didn't lead immediately to any full-time positions, but it did allow me to pick up freelance work here and there and begin to gain some practical experience in evaluating, full-length manuscripts, and eventually in book reviewing. I got by a series of, further accidents that we won't bother to detail. I ended up becoming one of the science fiction reviewers for Publishers Weekly, an anonymous but surprisingly powerful position. And I seemed to have really impressed them, and they gave me, basically as much work as I could handle, and in terms of, how fast I could read it and write. And I did it long enough that I became, there was no such title really as, senior science fiction and fantasy reviewer, but effectively that's what I was. There were 2 or 3 other people doing it, but I was the one who got first pick of all the books that came in, and they made sure that I saw, all the stuff the publishers considered the most important. So in the course of doing that, even though the reviews were unsigned, people in the field knew who it was, and they could immediately see that the quality of the reviews had improved, both in terms of the writing, and I'm sorry to sound immodest, but both in terms of the quality of the writing and especially the quality of the expertise being applied, because I hadn't been reading science fiction by that point for over 20 years. Well, not quite, because I would have been, yeah, all right, yeah, that's probably about right, because I didn't get it right out of college. It was a few years later. So I had a deep background in the field and could, really talk intelligently in these very small reviews. And people appreciated that. People noticed it, and that also contributed to my getting freelance work. And so I just went along that way for a while. Probably at that point, I should have been making a second round at attempts to get a full-time assistant job somewhere. But I really liked the freelance thing. I liked the freedom of it, even though I made for a little money. And my parents were really ridiculously indulgent and let me get away with that. So I had various jobs at various times. I had a part-time gig where I worked for Jim Frankel, who was the editor at Dell Books. They weren't, Dell, for whatever reason, wasn't giving him a full-time assistant, but they were willing to pay for a part-time assistant. So I was going in there for like half days or sometimes for full days, but only a few days a week. Then I had another job where I worked in the sales department at Basic Books, where they needed extra help, but they didn't need a full-time person, so I was doing that 2 or 3 days a week. So I was seeing different parts of publishing without quite getting a full-time job. And eventually, around, I guess it was 79 maybe, or 80, I heard through the grapevine that there was going to be an opening at the SF Book Club, that Ellen Asher, who or at that point already been the editor there for many, many years, was looking for a new assistant. So I applied for that job, and she and I really hit it off well. I thought I had a great shot at getting the job, and I didn't get it. This time I was not beat out by a cute girl who could type faster, but by another guy, a guy named Mike Cohen, who turned out to be brilliant, because I got to know him later. And he got the job, I found out eventually, because Ellen was not, at that point, being given a full-time assistant herself. She was being asked to share her assistant with another editor, and the other editor was the editor of the Crafts Book Club. And Mike, luckily for him, knew something about crafts, whereas I knew zero. So Ellen liked me better, she thought. Well, she liked Mike, but she liked me better, but she had to concede and pick the person who would work for both editors. So Mike got the job. And 2 or 3 years went by. I continued doing my freelance mixture of part-time jobs and freelance jobs. And I heard that Mike was leaving, and I applied again, and this time I got hired. I found out later that it had once again come down to 2 people. and in this case, it was me and Claire Eddy, and of course, Claire is now a colleague of mine at Tor. She's actually was at Tor well ahead of me, so it's kind of funny how that worked out. And she and I didn't know this till just a few years ago, actually. I don't know how the subject came up, but Ellen and I were talking about it, and she said, "Oh yeah, that was Claire, didn't you know?" But anyway, Mike was a great guy. I used to go after I applied for that job and Mike got it. Ellen had offered me freelance work, reading for the club. So I was going in there every week, and I got to know him. And I didn't, have any resentment that he got the job. I understood the circumstances once I'd heard the whole story. And he was not only a real science fiction fan, which I was happy about, but he was also a big theater nut and interested in drama and in theater. And what ended up happening was he got a writing gig writing for one of the soap operas that was based in New York. And he left the club to do that full time, and he eventually became one of the leading writers of soap operas and got very successful and rich and has a house in Santa Monica. So he ended up just fine. But anyway, so I started the club in '84. And it quickly became obvious that my feeling on that first interview, 3 years earlier, was exactly right. Ellen and I were just perfectly suited to each other. We had very similar, or at least complementary personalities, and I was one of the few people who could read her handwriting. And she was willing to tolerate my foibles, like the fact that I hate getting up in the morning, so I was almost always late. And we went off from there. So, I very quickly got promoted from editorial assistant to assistant to the editor to assistant editor, and Ellen was letting me buy some of the books for the club. And the book club, in addition to the monthly, or actually the more than monthly, but people think of them as monthly bulletins, the book club actually has, depending on which book club, it can be 14 to 16, quote, months, unquote, per year. So we call them cycles, actually. So anyway, each cycle would have, the monthly, the cyclical bulletin in it, which in the case of the SF Book Club is Things to Come. And then there'd be other flyers stuck in there for, to supplement it. And so my job became producing those flyers, and I got to buy the books for them. So I got some practical experience, even though when you're a book club editor, you're not working with authors. You are making selections of books, and you're applying your taste to the benefit of the readership. And I also learned negotiating skills because I had to, deal with the sub-rights people or the agents to buy these books. So I ended up staying at the book clubs for 11 years, which is way longer than I ever imagined. During that period, the Doubleday family sold the company, and we became part of Bertelsmann, which is a big German media conglomerate that also runs book clubs in Europe. And that had, some revolutionary effect on the place. It had been a very stodgy, old-fashioned place, and Bertelsmann came in and just, blew the dust off everything. So that was a very interesting period. And somewhere in there, roughly halfway through my 11 years, I guess this would have been around 89. I was in England on vacation with my girlfriend, staying with friends in East London, and we would go out to the theater every night. And now these were friends that I met through fandom, I should mention. So being in fandom gives you, the opportunity to travel internationally and stay with friends. And it was actually a couple that was an American woman and a British guy who had met through fandom, and she'd married him and moved to London. So we came back to our friend's home after seeing whatever show it was that night, and they said, Moshe, your Ellen Asher called you. She has important news from the book club, and she wants you to call right back. And of course, it's early, even though it was like probably almost midnight in London, it's 5 hours earlier in New York, so that was no problem. So I called her, and she said, "Oh, Moshe, thanks for calling back. Well, there have been major things happening at the book club because of Bertelsmann, and I have good news and bad news." And I'm going, "Oh, she has good news and bad news. Okay, well, let me have the bad news first so that I can, I'll finish the phone call with a better taste in my mouth." And she said, "Okay, well, the bad news is that your job is being eliminated. You're redundant. Well, I'm really sorry, but they decided we don't need a specialist, doing what you're doing." By this point, I had really stopped working for her. I was reporting directly to the editor-in-chief, and I was doing other stuff while continuing to buy books for the SF Book Club and the Literary Guild and some of the other clubs, and doing flyers and organizing various other bureaucratic things. And I was like a little kind of crushed to hear that, as you can imagine. And she said, but wait, don't get too upset. I said, okay, what's the good news? The good news is, if you're interested, you can have a promotion. I said, what? I said, yeah. You said I was fired. She said, yeah, well, your old job doesn't exist anymore, but you're not fired if you want to stay. I said, okay, well, what kind of promotion are we talking about? She said, well, John O'Brien is leaving, and if you're interested, you can be the editor of the Military Book Club. I'm going, wow, my own book club. Now, let me make clear here, I am by no means a military buff. I am not an expert on military history or military technology or military anything. But my own book club, well, I certainly was not going to say no to that. So I said, I can take it, and I knew that John, who was a good friend of mine because he'd been, an assistant sitting at a neighboring desk to mine, a few years earlier, had been no more a military expert than I was. He'd been an English major just like me. And unfortunately, what had happened was the man he was working for, Tom Davis, who had been the Military Book Club editor for like 15 years or more, died. He was one of the early victims of the AIDS epidemic. And John was his assistant, and everybody knew he was smart and capable, and they promoted him to fill Tom's position. So after doing it for 2 or 3 years, I don't remember exactly, John, completely coincidentally, this has nothing to do with the reorganization that my job was a victim of, but just by sheer good luck for me, John had decided, and remember this is during summer vacation, had decided it was time for him to move on, and he had been accepted for grad school, and he was going to get his PhD in English and become a professor. And that's in fact what he ended up doing. He is a professor now. If that hadn't happened, I would have been, out on my ass. But luckily for me, John chose the right moment to go off to grad school. So I came back to New York and found myself with a whole new set of responsibilities. And I don't know if I can convey quite how much anxiety I felt, because I can imagine. I knew I was faking it. I had 150,000 members that I had to keep happy, picking books for.
Wow.
And the editor of a book club is in charge of all the marketing as well as picking the books. It's quite a responsibility. Now, obviously, I knew a lot about the systems and procedures from having worked for Ellen for so long, but that's not quite the same as being the deciding person,
Right.
And everything comes to you. So that was an interesting challenge, and I'm very grateful for her support and the support of my other colleagues at the book clubs, who helped me get through those first few months, which were definitely challenging. But it worked out okay. I mean, luckily for me, I am in many ways a typical editorial personality, and I think like most editors, there's one or two things I'm an expert in, maybe, but I'm interested in almost everything. I know a little bit about something about almost everything, and people always, since I was a little kid, have considered me a know-it-all. So it wasn't such a stretch to I mean, my mother used to call me the professor. So when I was like 8, so it wasn't such a stretch to be working in a nonfiction field all of a sudden. And I did have a strong interest in history. I mean, I'd been an English major with a psychology minor, but I'd taken some history courses, and I read history for fun on my own. So it really was not a huge hardship to suddenly be reading lots of military history or buying, books about airplanes or whatever. So it worked out okay. And I guess the numbers could speak for themselves. The club grew while I was the editor, and of course, the other members of the marketing staff must share in the credit for that. But at least my book picks weren't chasing members out. That's the key thing. And I actually had a couple of the most successful books in the history of the club in terms of copies sold. Because I tried some experiments, and some of them worked out. So it actually turned out to be quite enjoyable. I mean, once I adjusted to my new position and got used to it, I met a lot of interesting people in the world of military publishing. There's a lot of small specialist publishers, and they were all really great people, and mostly men, but some women too. And they appreciated the fact that I didn't bullshit them. I didn't try to pretend that I was an expert that I wasn't, and I explained that I'd never, served in the armed forces, and I just an editor, and I'd require their guidance, and they gave me honest and fair answers, and it worked out okay. So I did that for 5 or 6 years, and at that point I was getting a little itchy to get back to science fiction, and I was also getting more and more impatient with the Bertelsmann management people. They kept promising me things and then not keeping their promises. And you'll recall earlier in my lengthy accounts here, I talked about various editors who had to share assistants and so on. And they were giving me more and more to do, and I was still working with half an assistant. And I was not happy about that. And they each time they, talked about expanding the staff, this is going to be, you're going to get your full-time assistant now, and then somehow it wouldn't happen. So I finally just said, to myself, well, if you do this again, I'm just going to give up. I'm going to say goodbye. You've broken your promise too many times, and that's essentially what happened. And so I left. I figured, better to go out while I'm on top and everything's going well. And before I start to burn out from effectively the speed up situation that they were putting me in. And of course, I missed all my Doubleday friends, but Ellen and I stayed in touch, and in fact remain friends to this day. I consider her my honorary older sister, and we do stuff together all the time. I went back to science fiction work and freelancing. I didn't go back to Publishers Weekly, but I did do other science fiction book reviewing for Science Fiction Chronicle, which is, along with Locus, at the time, one of the two newspapers of the field. And I also eventually got a job as one of the rotating team of reviewers at Asimov's SF magazine. And I did freelance work for Asimov's and for Analog and various publishers around town doing, I mostly did not do copy editing or that kind of work, and mostly did manuscript evaluation type stuff. So during my time at the book clubs, I actually had turned down the chance to be the actual head of the science fiction line, and I'm not going to tell you which one, but it was a real offer, and I came very close to accepting it, and I was really torn because it seemed like this is my opportunity. I'm going to finally have the job exactly that I wanted, and I didn't take it ultimately because when I did my research and tried to find out what the working conditions were like, everybody I spoke to was telling me how awful a place it was to work. That's why I'm not telling you where it was. And in particular, that the publisher there was a very, very difficult woman, and that I would have, unless I somehow managed to be the exceptional employee who somehow charmed her, I was going to have a tough time. Let me just stop for a drink here. And I thought, on one hand, I really want this job, be the person in charge of buying these books and working with these authors. And on the other hand, what happens if I go to this place and I hate it or she hates me and I'm out of my ass in 3 months, and then I've lost the book club job, So I stayed at the book club, and I think based on what I saw happen to the people who did take that job eventually, it was probably the right decision. Never to be sure. Maybe I would have been the person to charm her out of her usual nasty habits. But with that in my pocket, I felt like, okay, sooner or later someone's going to give me another shot. I'm not getting any younger at this point, but because I was born in '51, and we're talking about the early '90s. So I'm by no means a kid or a typical applicant. And David Hartwell, who I consider to be probably the single greatest book editor in the field's history, asked me if I wanted to come work for him at Tor as his assistant and a chance to train as an acquiring editor. And normally I would have jumped at it, but the problem was that I was having health issues. It turned out with something I had probably been always a factor, but I hadn't realized it, and I had only officially, gotten recognized and diagnosed in the latter part of my book club career. It turned out that I was bipolar and manic depression, And I didn't feel that it was sufficiently well controlled at that point, and I was worried about working for him and not being able to, keep up with the demands of the job. And I said, David, I'm dying to do this, but I just don't know that I could promise you the quality of support you would want from me, and I think I'd better say no for now. So I continued with working with my doctor and my psychiatrist and so on, trying to find the right combination of medications. And he hired Jim Minns, who turned out to work out very well, and Jim is now, what's his title, executive editor or something at Bain. And a few years went by, and so now we're up to 2000, and I was feeling much better. My medications were working, and I got a job, perforce a temporary one, because it always is, working for the census, and 2000 census, and I was not an enumerator, one of those people who goes around from door to door. I was an office worker, and they quickly noticed that I was very good at the job and that I understood the complicated rules that the clerks have to apply and the enumerators have to apply, and within a few weeks I was assigned to teaching, and I was teaching clerks and enumerators all these complicated rules. And then one of the supervisors said, Moshe, you're obviously very bright and talented. Why don't you take the exam and become one of the office managers? So I took the exam and got the promotion, and within a couple of months of being there, I was in charge of an office of over 100 people. And I thought, okay, I guess I am okay, if I can do this. So when a few months later, towards the end of the census, job, David came to me again and said, Moshe, how are you feeling these days? Jim Minns is leaving. Would you like to come work for me? And I said, you know something? Yes. So in 2000, I finally started in a position where I was allowed to acquire books and work with authors, at first under David's supervision and eventually on my own. And I started out at Tor not as a editorial assistant, because they recognized my, I'd been the editor-in-chief of the Military Book Club, for God's sake. So they compromised and made me an associate editor. And I simultaneously, worked for myself in terms of acquisitions, and also supported David, which was, partly an editor needs an assistant, but also to give me a chance to learn all the various systems involved and procedures. And that worked out well. It was a little strange because at this point, Hartwell and I had been friends for 25 years or something. And it's a little strange going to work for a friend. We definitely did not have a typical, boss-employee relationship, because we just were friends. So that could get awkward at times, but it mostly worked out. The friendship went back to meeting at conventions, and then later on, when I was reviewing for PW, he noticed the fact that I was mostly giving his books at Timescape really good reviews, and we were discussing them, and we pretty quickly concluded that we had similar tastes, and I think that was probably why he had asked me the first time around. He figured, I'm a bright guy who he could trust to have similar responses to editorial issues that would arise. And okay, so that's in very very long terms how I got from wanting to be a physicist and an astronaut to being an editor at Tor. And within a few years, it took me a while to get my feet under me and find stuff I was sufficiently enthusiastic about. In fact, the first thing I bought wasn't SF at all. It was a mainstream satirical novel about Vietnam called Namarama, which got great reviews and sold well, but not bestseller level well, but sold well. And then my big break was in 2001. I attended the World Fantasy Convention. Now, World Fantasy is held in October, typically, and 2001 means it was literally just a few weeks after the 9/11 attacks. It was the atmosphere was a little bit different from usual, I suspect. People were all the New York publishing people who came to World Fantasy, which was up in Montreal that year, I think were, in a way, happy to get out of the city. It was like to sort of put that behind us for a while, not be thinking about this horrible tragedy that had happened. And while I was there, a bunch of college kids, who had seen me on some of the panels that I was on, came up to me one evening and said, they'd love to talk to me because they knew I was an editor, and they had, I don't know, I can't even remember what we talked about, but all kinds of publishing-related questions. And afterward, two of them approached me and said, would I be willing to read their stuff if they sent me manuscripts after they got back from the con? And I said, of course. And one of those guys was Dan Wells, who I now publish, and the other was Brandon Sanderson, who I now publish.
Dan was on the show a few weeks ago.
That was... Uh-huh.
I was saying Dan was a guest on the show a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I heard. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
ahead.
Anyway,
no, that's okay. So anyway, that was obviously very lucky. Again, this just goes to show you how much luck plays into these things. People always think of the progress of people's careers, is primarily a matter of talent or something. But obviously you have to have some kind of talent. But just being stubborn and being lucky counts for at least as much. And that was certainly true in this case. I just refused to give up. I was going to have an SF job one way or another. And nothing else really interested me nearly as much. Nothing else I felt, frankly, worth getting up out of bed for nearly as much. And I'd rather sleep late. So, and here again, luck was really the thing. I mean, I could easily never have met those guys. And Brandon had sent the novel. We usually, for the sake of convenience, refer to it as his first novel, Elantris, but it's his first published novel. He'd actually written a number of novels prior to that, but hadn't sold any, and I don't even know how many of them he actually tried submitting. Elantris had made some rounds already at that point and been turned down elsewhere, and I can see why. It wasn't perfect. There were flaws, but. And indeed, the first time I started reading it, I sort of read the first few pages, first few chapters, and I thought, it's okay. But I also saw a lot that was wrong with it, and I wasn't immediately swept away. And I put it aside. And then Brandon and I argue about how much time went by after that, but it was quite a while. And at some point, weeks or months later, I picked it up again. I thought, oh, that poor kid, he's such a nice young man at the convention. I really can't leave him hanging. I've got to finish reading this thing and at least give him, a detailed evaluation so he'll have, like he used to do at Amazing, so he'll know what he needs to do. So I go back and start all over again at the beginning, and I continue reading this time, and lo and behold, somewhere, 75, 100 pages in, it starts to get really good. And I'm going, wow, this is way better than I thought. And I'm reading another 50, 100 pages, and going, wow, I'm totally gripped by this now. And I basically did not, stop. I just read the whole thing through without stopping at that point. And by the time I was done, I knew I was going to buy this book. And I was, really excited. Excited for myself and for him. I could see that he had something special, and I'm kind of amazed that nobody else had picked up on it, frankly. The manuscript had a phone number on it, and I called the phone number, and the number was disconnected. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. No, obviously, I had his address. I thought I could write to him, but I really was eager to get in touch with him and give him the good news, and and so on. And luckily, I remembered that he'd said he was active in the Brigham Young University SF Club. So I looked him up online and saw that, in fact, he seemed to still be there. And then I, started exploring the BYU website and found that there was a student directory, and discovered that the reason his old number didn't work anymore was that he'd switched to grad school. He wasn't in the, the undergrad dorm anymore. He was now a grad student. So I was able to get the number for his dorm room and call him, and he happened to be in. And I got to tell him over the phone that, I'd read his book and I wanted to buy it. So you can imagine he was absolutely thrilled. And so we went on from there. I hope I'll find in my lifetime at least 2 or 3 more people who are somewhere in the same range of talent and energy as Brandon has. But clearly he's been so far, my most important discovery and the most important thing I've done in terms of publishing has been to bring him to the public's attention and make what contribution I could to improving his work. And and then luck played a further role because we had the tragic, much too early, premature death of Robert Jordan, and through a series of circumstances that Brandon himself has written about, and your listeners can go look up. Brandon ended up becoming, the anointed successor who would finish The Wheel of Time, and there's no question that Brandon would have become a major author anyway. He was already at that point, starting to nibble at the bottom of the bestseller list. But having Robert Jordan's gigantic readership become aware of him all of a sudden, this catapulted him up, to a whole new level that he otherwise might not have reached on his own for 5 or 10 years. So his career has just been going from, one success to another, and he continues to produce prodigies because, as you've heard today, we're going to be publishing 2 books in the Mistborn sequence next year, one in October and the other, I think it's going to be officially a January pub date, but it will actually come out in late December. So we're really excited about that. I mean, we know they're both going to be very successful commercially, but particularly because circumstances having been what they were, the Stormlight Archive books, which he feel are his, sort of masterpiece at this stage in his career, and are really going to be the foundation of his permanent reputation. We've only done 2 of those so far, and they were like 3 or 4 years apart, and that's not the way you want to do it. You want to have them come out every year or 2, preferably. Given such big books, 2 or even 2.5 years is not outrageous, and it's still much faster than George Martin is managing. And I say that with affection because George is an old friend, but he's taking his time, and it just wasn't possible. Brandon was working on his own stuff and working on the Jordan things. In addition to starting to play around with writing young adult fiction, and we just couldn't get those books out as fast as we wanted. So the chance to offer the readership, I think at this point most Sanderson fans read everything he does. So to that extent, the people who are dying for another Stormlight book can at least have 2 Mistborn books this year, or this coming year, and that should, we hope, make them feel a little bit better about having to exert so much patience. And I should say, if you've heard the story that this particular sequence of Mistborn books that began with the Alloy of Law are themselves the result sort of an accident. They weren't planned. The original idea for Mistborn, and we didn't even explain this early on. As far as everybody was concerned, we were publishing the Mistborn trilogy, but Brandon and I always knew that the plan was to have 3 trilogies. The original Mistborn trilogy is a trilogy set in what you might think of as the mythological, ancient past of Scadrial, the Mistborn world. And Brandon wanted to write 2 more trilogies, one set in that world equivalent of the 20th century, a point at which the events of the first book would become, part of, myth and legend, or even of religion. And you'd have a world in which technology had been created, but the magic that we had learned about in the first trilogy would still be around. So you'd have this mixture of science and magic. And then the third trilogy was going to be, or we still expect it will be, set in the future of so to speak, of Scadrial, corresponding not to the 20th century of Earth, but maybe like the 23rd or the 24th century, like the Star Trek future of Earth. So you'd have a 9-book sequence that would span, the whole spectrum from a fantasy world to a really very science fictional world, but one that still had magic in it. So with that as the background, what happened was Brandon had finished, I can't remember now which one of the Jordan books, and he needed what he calls a mental palate cleanser before starting on his next full-time project, which was going to be Way of Kings, the first Stormlight Archive book. Yeah. And he planned to write sorry?
No, I was just saying Stormlight.
Yeah, Stormlight. Yeah.
Yeah.
So so he was planning to write a novelette or novella or something, and he thought it would be fun to set it in the world of Mistborn, but not sort of not with any of the existing characters, and he wanted to invent new situations. So he decided to have it set in the period between the first and second trilogies, closer to the second. So it's roughly comparable to Earth's 19th century. And what happened was it kind of ran away from him, and it turned from a short story into a novella into a novel. And he literally called me up and said, "Moshe, I hope you don't mind, but I've accidentally written a novel." And I said, "You accidentally wrote a novel? Okay. Well, of course, we'll be happy to buy it. What is it?" And we explained. So, everybody was very excited. We found a place for it on the schedule, and lo and behold, it became a bestseller. And now we have to make a deal and figure out how to fit these in with his other obligations and keep this new series going. And I didn't know immediately what he had in mind. It turns out it's intended to be a 4-book sequence. And we were just planning to publish the second one, but now we're going to be publishing the second and the third. So it's very exciting. And I've read the first one of the new ones already, and it's very good. And interestingly enough, everybody who's finished the second book, which would be his agent Joshua Bilmes and Tom Doherty, our publisher, was telling me, wait, you read the second one, it's even better. And I was in the middle of other stuff, so I couldn't get to it right away. But I've now started it, and I'm maybe about halfway through. And lo and behold, they're right. It is even better, which is hard to believe considering how good the first one is. So it's going to be a really fun sequence to publish, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to probably be editing them over the Christmas break, and hopefully have them for Brandon to look at early in the new year. And he's got other obligations to Random House and to his family, so he won't be working on them right away. But there won't be any problem at all getting them out for the fall and winter next year. All right, so there, going on for however long it's been, an hour maybe, and you haven't even asked me another question yet.
That's okay. What advice would you have, Moshe, for a writer that might be in that Brandon Sanderson position, where you have the gift, you have put in the time, and you are pursuing your craft, but it's just not, you just can't seem to get any traction. And like you said, and like Brandon has said before, I don't want to misquote him, but I want to think that he said that his first purchased book was like his 11th or 13th novel, something like that. What advice would you give? What advice would you give someone to?
Book and,
yeah.
Well, there's no easy or simple answer to that. There's certainly no one right way that it has to happen. The first thing is obviously persistence and belief in yourself has to come first, because this is always hard. It's very rare that somebody makes a sale their first time out. That's truly the exception. The second thing is you've got to look for markets that are open to unsolicited submissions. Some publishers are and some aren't. Sometimes you might have to try to find an agent first in order to get into the door. That can be hard in itself. Brandon did not have an agent when he sent me Elantris, and got one later on in time to do the negotiations on it. I think making a personal connection, if you can, is definitely useful. I mean, science fiction and fantasy aspiring writers really have a tremendous advantage here over writers in just about any other field, because if you're a literary writer or a writer in some other genre, although other genres now are starting to have conventions, and there's a lot of online activity as well that we didn't used to have. But the key thing is you have a lot of potential ways that you can meet people who work on the editorial side, and I think if you're not having any luck just submitting stuff blindly, and actually you should never submit blindly. You should always know where you're going, in the sense of having analyzed the list of the publisher you're interested in, and you should be able to say to yourself, and maybe even in your cover letter, I've looked at your line, and I think my book fits in well to the following 2 or 3 reasons. So you're not just hoping that it's going to be a random lucky fit. But if you're not succeeding that way, I think the single best thing you can do is go to conventions and try to meet editors, meet agents, but especially editors. And it's much harder for an editor to say no to somebody in person, frankly. And if somebody comes up to you as an editor and they talk about their book and they do it politely and they don't talk your ear off and they make a good case of themselves and they seem intelligent, then if they ask you at the end of the conversation, can they send you their book, you're going to say yes. And once you put yourself in that situation, you're already ahead of 90% of the submission because the editor has met you, has a face to connect with the manuscript, and it's not going to end up at the bottom of the slush pile. It's going to be, one of the first things they look at. Maybe not instantly, because there's always a backlog, but sooner rather than later. So that would be my number one recommendation. The other thing you can do in science fiction that can be hard in other fields where there is no market to speak of for short fiction is that you can do short fiction and sell to the surviving magazines or to some of the websites like Tor.com that now pay for fiction. And that's a great way to become both better known and to be visible to editors and just to build up a resume. And even if an editor hasn't heard of you before and hasn't happened to have looked at the magazine issue you're in or the website you're on, if you can say in your cover letter, dear Mr. Editor or dear Miss Editor, here's my manuscript, and I published 10 stories in analog and fantasy and science fiction and Tor.com. Obviously, they're going to take you more seriously. So, as hard as it may seem to aspiring science fiction and fantasy writers, the truth is they're in a much better position than almost any other kind of writer to make their way from aspiring amateur to professional. And if you use both of those avenues to improve your chances, you're going to be much likelier to succeed. Now, having said that, let's also recognize that science fiction and fantasy are part of the whole world of publishing. It is undergoing a revolution right now. And I don't know what things are going to be like in 5 years. It really may be that the role of the traditional publishing companies will shrink and self-publishing will become more important. E-books make that usually more practical than it used to be. I mean, we used to laugh at people who self-publish, frankly, because it almost never worked. They would almost always end up with hundreds or thousands of copies of their books in their basement or their garage. They had no way to market them successfully, and it just almost never worked. So now you've got print on demand, and you've got e-publishing, and you have gigantic venues like Amazon.com and some of the independent websites devoted to e-books, and you actually can make money doing that, right. And you aren't risking as much. You aren't required to invest in physical books in the same way, and you aren't going to get ripped off by vanity publishers in the same way. So, if somebody's really that frustrated and feels they aren't getting noticed, then they can certainly go off and do it themselves. Now, having said that, let me make another pitch here for yet another aspect, which is that if you decide you want to self-publish, that's fine. You need to go into it having studied carefully, what's involved, all the complexities of it. Talk to other people who have done it. Try to learn from their mistakes and their experience, because I'm sure there are parts of it that I don't even know about that will largely influence how successful you are. And don't think you can be your own editor. Nobody can be their own editor. Even an editor can't be his own editor. It's just in the nature of the way our brains work. You cannot look at yourself objectively and your work objectively. Now, you can simulate it a little bit. You can put your work aside for a month or two and then come back to it refreshed, and it won't be quite so familiar, and that can help. And that's, even putting work aside for a day or two can sometimes be useful in that respect when you're working on the book and revising it. But I would highly recommend anybody who wants to self-publish, they should still go out and hire an editor. Yes. There are lots of freelancers around who want the work. Some of them, charge a little. Some of them charge a lot. That's something you've got to figure out depending on your resources. But you need that alien eye that doesn't already have a brain behind it in which grooves have been worn by those lines of text. And that's what happens when you read your own stuff. You're basically massaging these same grooves in your brain. I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, but
right.
It's very. But what I usually tell people is it's exactly the same thing as why you can't tickle yourself. It's a closed loop, and you can't tickle yourself. And it's the same thing. You can't edit yourself because you already know or think you know how it's supposed to go. And it's the same reason why it can be very hard to proofread your own stuff, even because you know what you meant to say, and a lot of times your vision system will actually fool you, and you think you're reading what you meant to say, and then you discover later on when it's said in type that no, it's full of typos that you missed. So at Tor, all the editors are also writers. We all, even aside from whatever blogs we might have, or Facebook activity like me, or any other book reviewing or whatever we do on the side, we're all writers for the company. We all write copy, and nobody's allowed to have their copy, set into type before somebody else reads it. So we have people on staff whose job it is to act as our editors. And I write stuff that I think is brilliant, and then I show it to Patrick, and he says, "No, that's pretty good, but you got to fix this and you got to fix that, and this has got the wrong tone or whatever." And I'll try again, and I'll say, "Oh yeah, it's better." And then similarly, Patrick shows his stuff to somebody else. So there's nobody who is immune to that, and would-be self-publishers need to remember that. It'll be a disaster for publishing and for the literary world in general if we get deluged at some point with thousands of books per year that are self-published but not edited,
right.
And nobody will benefit from that. Okay,
so if whether this person pursues traditional publishing or if they pursue self-publishing but get an editor and have a critique partner and have all of the layers of quality control in it, what's the best way for a writer to take that advice that they get from their editor and critique partners and put that into practical use?
Well, I think that very much depends on the writer. Everybody has their own approach to how they write, and that is such a distinctive thing. It's like a fingerprint almost. I don't know if there's a single answer I can give to that. You have to judge for yourself what parts of a reaction to what you've written to take seriously, and what parts you're going to, consider and maybe partially accept, and which parts they're going to reject. And when I work with an author, now most of the stuff we do, we're doing electronically. I've been talking blithely here about making submissions to editors as if it was still being done on paper, but actually most of the time I don't want paper anymore. I want to be sent a file that I can read on an electronic device. And I do almost all my work now either on my Mac or even more on my iPad. And it's really a relief not to have piles of paper around, actually. But anyway, that's really just the sidelight. What I was going to say was, so when I'm editing, and actually, we can use Brendan as an example because he's somebody who does meat editing for very much the reasons you're talking about. He writes very quickly, and I'm sure nobody who's a fan of his is surprised to hear that. He couldn't be as productive as he is otherwise. And a lot of times, sloppy isn't fair, but he's just not concerned with finding, le mot juste, as the French say, as long as it's approximately right. He wants to keep going. He doesn't want to lose his momentum. So he's speeding along, and then I come along after him, and I'm a little bit like the guy in the old Jay Ward cartoons, sweeping up after the parade. The garbage guy, sanitation man in the street sweeping up. So I'm there to sweep up and make things clean again. And one of the reasons that he and I have worked so well together is that we're on the same wavelength sufficiently that I can almost always tell exactly what he meant to say. He'll use a word that's an approximation, either in meaning or sound, to the one he actually wants, and I have to figure out what he really meant to say. So I'll pick a different word and suggest it to him, or if I'm really sure, I'll just stick it in. And sometimes I'll rearrange the order of the clauses in the sentence, and just generally clean it up. And the way we do this is, there's basically 2 or 3 levels of editorial certitude applies, right? So if I'm sure that what he's got is bad and what I want to do is the right one, I'll just stick it in and change it. Now, we're using track changes, which most advanced word processors, Microsoft Word or Apple's Pages have. And so you always see what was crossed out. It doesn't disappear. And so if you want to reject my change, he could just click on the reject button and it would go back to what it had been. And then the second thing I might do is, and I used to do this by writing a little note, on the page, and now you click and you create a little comment balloon or whatever, and you can say, how about this word or this word or this word? So I'm not picking a specific alternative for him. I'm saying here's a couple or three alternatives that I think are better than what you chose. Now, I think one of these would be more, I'm implying, or it's not necessarily explicitly saying, that one of these will be actually more accurate towards what I think his intention is. And then the third possibility is I might write him a note and I might say, I don't know what you mean here. I can't intuit this time what you have in mind, and you need to explain this to me, and then we'll figure out how it should be phrased. So most of the time, Brandon can go through a manuscript, or any of my authors can go through, and they'll typically, click accept on, 90 or 95% of the absolute changes I've made, and then there's some where they will revert them to what they were because they really liked what they said and they don't like what I'm saying. Or there might be some cases where the fact that I made an absolute change gets them to think, and they don't revert it, but they do change. They don't take what I said either. They come up with a third possibility. And similarly, they might choose, if it was one of those cases where I offered multiple choices, they'll pick one. Or come up with another one that I didn't think of, and so on. So, and then there are the ones where I just say, "What did you have in mind?" and on those, they will sometimes write or call and explain, or they will, just rewrite that section to make it clearer, and I'll find out later when I see the revision. And I think every editor does pretty much this process, however they indicate it physically, and the author has to learn how much they want to trust their editor. Hopefully, their editor is somebody they trust completely. But and if you're lucky, you have an editor who's on the same wavelength as you, and you're both very much going towards the same goals in terms of how you're trying to construct the book. And you can basically go along with their suggestions, but you have the right as the author to say no. And I've had arguments with most of my authors at some point where we disagree about something. And I will make the best case I can. And it's never a case of I'm the editor to do what I say. It doesn't work that way. I make the best case that I can, and if they finally agree, we go with it. And if we don't, well, it's their name on the book, not mine. I mean, Tor does put editorial credits in that the editors want them, and I like having it there. It's a tiny little credit on the copyright page. But unless you know to look for it, you're not going to see it. But the book has got the author's name on the front in big letters, and so ultimately, if I can't convince them that they're wrong and I'm right, they get to have their way. And as I've done this now, working with authors from scratch for about 14 years, I've gotten better at it too. And the key thing for the editor is to explain in a way that the author can understand and see that it's not just a matter of taste. Because, and sometimes word choice really is just a matter of taste, and there's no absolute, answer that you can prove mathematically is the right one or something like that. It really is all a matter of subjectivity and experience. But there's no, you can't do a chemical analysis on a manuscript and prove that the right words were used. So, but if I can explain to an author that I think the way they've chosen to construct a sentence or a paragraph or even a character is interfering with the overall goal of the story and telling the story as effectively as possible, then they usually come around. There's one or two cases specifically I can think of with Brandon where my first attempts to get him to see that something wasn't working, was getting nowhere. He kept interpreting it as, well, I think this works and you think it doesn't, and it's just a matter of taste. And I'm saying, no, it's not just a matter of taste. And I'm not so sure of myself that if he's particularly resistant, I might even go to a colleague and say, look at this section here and see what you think of it. And, I can check myself that way to see if my reaction is idiosyncratic or if, in fact, there really is something wrong with it. And in this particular instance I'm thinking of, anybody here I showed this thing to had the same reaction, which was that it wasn't working. And ultimately, I realized that I had to make Brandon understand that whether or not he thought it was working on one level, the way he had written it was pulling people out of the story. And that was something he got. Maybe he didn't ever completely understand why what he was doing wasn't working for me, but he could see once I showed it to him that what he was doing was pulling people out of the story. And the one thing, well, not the only, but one of many important things you don't want to do is pull people out of the story. So, to pick a trivial example, if you have a story set on an alien world and all of a sudden somebody makes a reference to the Yankees, they're going, what? why are you talking about the Yankees? On a foreign sport on a different planet. It would completely pull you out of the story and would break the spell. And writing any kind of fiction, is essentially about casting a spell over the reader. You're trying to draw them into the world of the story and to believe those people are real and what's happening to them is real and to get caught up in it. And that's even truer and more challenging with science fiction and fantasy, where you're not only creating the world of the characters and the characters' emotional experience or intellectual experience, but you're developing their whole environment, whether it's the future or a fantasy landscape or the some historical era or a combination of those. You have to make all of that convincing, and it's one of the reasons why I think in some ways SF and fantasy are a superior genre to mainstream fiction, because our challenge is really much greater. If you're going to really achieve literary, excellence, you've got to do it not just characterizationally, but in every other way too. So consistency and originality and the ability to describe things in a sufficiently evocative way, are tremendously important. Because you don't want realistic people acting out their parts in front of a bunch of cardboard flats. You want to have people in a three-dimensional landscape. And similarly, and contrary-wise, you don't want to have a beautiful landscape inhabited by robots, zombies that you're pushing around. You want the characters to appear to be self-motivated. So it really is a challenge for SF and fantasy writers. They've got to be able to do both things equally well. A mainstream writer can just tell the reader in effect, well, this story is set in London in 1942. It's the middle of the Blitz. World War II is raging, blah, blah, blah. And the reader already has a built-in vocabulary of scenes and facts, and history about that situation. And you can barely sketch it in, and they can do all the work for you. And then you can focus on the plot and the characters. And that person, or fantasy writer cannot do that. They can't just say, it's London in 1942. They have to describe every single bit, or at least give the impression of describing every single bit, which is one of the tricks of the field. If you do that, then the reader, wants to come back to it and come back to it and come back to it. And that's one of the reasons why we've had this trend, especially since the whole Tolkien revolution, where people don't want just a single book. They want to be able to come back and explore worlds in depth. And the challenge for the writer is not just to create an interesting world, but to make it so rich and deep that it really can support multiple visits in that way.
Right. Moshe Feder, this has been a fascinating hour and a half. It has flown by, but we are out of time. I just want to say thank you for the contributions that you have made to the genre and to so many books that I love, and thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thank you. I was delighted to be invited, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I never tire of talking about SF and fantasy. They're kind of like my life and my religion, and so I'm always happy to do it, and I hope your listeners enjoy it.